This is not and should not be a Republican versus Democratic issue. This is actually an American epidemic, and frankly, it should be viewed more as an American male issue. The men are the ones who are committing the vast majority of the abuse, and we need to work together in this body and across the country to be united to stop it. Mr. President, I will be voting to confirm Judge Kavanaugh as the next Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. But on this broader topic that I've been discussing this afternoon, our country has a lot of healing and a lot of work to do. And I'm certainly ready to do my part in that regard with all of my Senate colleagues, Republican and Democrat. I yield the floor.
The senator from Maryland.
I thank you, Mr. President. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution gives this body, the Senate, the responsibility to advise and consent on judicial appointments. It's an important check on executive power. We are invested with this special responsibility to ensure that individuals nominated by the President to be Supreme Court justices will be people who make decisions fairly and impartially, without favor and without bias. That is why Lady Justice wears a blindfold and holds a balanced scale on which to weigh the merits of arguments and claims that come before her. The integrity of the Supreme Court requires that every person who comes before that court can have confidence that each justice will fairly weigh the evidence and the arguments. Mr. President, Judge Kavanaugh does not meet that standard. I had concerns at the very beginning of this process, and I fear it more than ever today at the end of the process. Any remaining hope that Judge Kavanaugh could be trusted to be an impartial justice or perceived to be an impartial justice was shattered by his opening statement at his last hearing. In that statement, which he emphasized, he wrote in his own words, Judge Kavanaugh launched into an ultra-partisan diatribe and wild conspiracy theories. He suggested that Dr. Ford's compelling testimony about her sexual assault was somehow manufactured by Democrats as payback for his participation in the Starr investigation, as if Dr. Ford was an actor in a bitter partisan battle rather than a brave citizen who had come forward to tell her story. While Judge Kavanaugh attempted the other day to walk back his words in his Wall Street Journal op-ed, the damage he did is irreversible. If he is confirmed, hundreds of people who come before the Supreme Court and the millions of Americans whose lives will be affected by his decisions will believe that Judge Kavanaugh has already put his hands on the scale of justice before they have their say in court. That is why, Mr. President, hundreds of law professors, Jesuits, and personal friends withdrew their previous support for his nomination after his statement at that hearing. That is why the American Bar Association has called a meeting to reconsider their endorsement. And that is why former Justice John Paul Stevens took the extraordinary step of saying that Judge Kavanaugh is not fit to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. Mr. President, it didn't have to be this way. The process was flawed from the start, and it got worse as time went on. It started when President Trump contracted out the process of picking a Supreme Court nominee to right-wing groups like the Federalist Society, like the Heritage Foundation. During his campaign, candidate Trump said he was going to pick Supreme Court nominees based not on who would be impartial, based not on who would be independent, but based on who would do his bidding on certain issues. He had a number of litmus tests. For example, during the campaign, when talking about the Affordable Care Act, candidate Trump promised that, unlike Chief Justice Roberts, his nominee would, quote, do the right thing, unquote, and get rid of the Affordable Care Act. The Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation, they didn't need much coaxing, but they dutifully compiled lists of names of people to fit the bill. And Judge Kavanaugh fit the bill. He fit the bill according to his own former law clerks. One of his former law clerks wrote an article entitled, quote, Brett Kavanaugh said Obamacare was unprecedented and unlawful, unquote, in order to assure people that Judge Kavanaugh would be the Justice Kavanaugh to undo the protections of the Affordable Care Act. Another one of Judge Kavanaugh's own law clerks said, and I quote, "No other contender on President Trump's list is on record so vigorously criticizing the Affordable Care Act." These are Judge Kavanaugh's law clerks. Mr. President, we all know that the case of Texas v. United States, which threatens to take away protections from millions of people with pre-existing conditions, is currently making its way through our federal courts as we gather here today. It was filed by a group of 20 Republican attorney generals, and the Trump administration decided not to defend the current law, decided not to defend the Affordable Care Act, and said to these Republican attorney generals, have at it. Get rid of the Affordable Care Act. We know that that case, the Texas case, is very likely to end up in the Supreme Court of the United States. And in Judge Kavanaugh, President Trump has, according to Judge Kavanaugh's own law clerks, his man to rule against the Affordable Care Act, and in doing so, stripping millions of Americans from their protections from pre-existing health conditions. On the issue of a woman's right to reproductive freedom and choice, candidate Trump promised he would appoint a justice to take those rights away. Specifically, he said overturning Roe, quote, will happen automatically, in my opinion, because I am appointing pro-life justices on the court, end quote. Again, he found his man in Judge Kavanaugh. And again, we have Judge Kavanaugh's own law clerks saying as much. In a July 3rd, 2018, National Review article, one of his former clerks wrote, quote, no court of appeals judge in the nation has a stronger, more consistent record of enforcing restrictions on abortion, end quote. Now, at the confirmation hearing, we all heard Judge Kavanaugh say that Roe v. Wade was an important precedent and said to some senators it was settled law. But we know from many Republican judicial nominees who testified before the Senate about settled law that as soon as they got on the Supreme Court, it's no longer settled. In fact, Judge Kavanaugh, before he was judge, said himself in a 2003 memo, which came to light, quote, I am not sure that all legal scholars refer to Roe as settled law of the land at the Supreme Court level, since the court can always overrule its precedent. A clear indication of where Judge Kavanaugh's reasoning lies, especially in light of the testimony from his own law clerks. If you look at other parts of his record, you'll find that Judge Kavanaugh consistently rules in favor of powerful special interests and against the public interests. He has sided with those who want to lift all the restrictions on political campaign expenditures. In one opinion, Judge Kavanaugh wrote that PACs are constitutionally entitled to raise and spend unlimited money in support of candidates for elected office because it was, quote, implausible, unquote, that contributions from independent groups could corrupt candidates. Those million-dollar expenditures on behalf of candidates, they have no impact on the thinking of that candidate once they're elected, according to Judge Kavanaugh, of course, according to the Citizens United decision. In fact, Judge Kavanaugh has been credited by one campaign finance expert as, quote, the man who created the super PAC, unquote. Judge Kavanaugh has gone farther. He's even suggested that limits on direct contributions to candidates are unconstitutional. Back in March 2002, in an email, he said, quote, "I've heard very few people say that the limits on contributions to candidates are unconstitutional, although I, for one, tend to think those limits have some constitutional problems." So we can see that if it's Justice Kavanaugh, not only will he double down on Citizens United, which says that corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money, including unlimited amounts of secret money, but he questions the constitutionality of putting limits not only on independent expenditures, but on direct contributions to candidates. We know Judge Kavanaugh was also the pick for those who want corporate power to trump workers' rights, consumer rights, and environmental protections. The day that Judge Kavanaugh was nominated for the Supreme Court, the White House circulated a letter to corporate leaders touting the fact that he would protect their interests. The White House proudly noted that he has overruled federal regulators 75 times on cases involving clean air, consumer protections, net neutrality, and other issues. When it comes to workers' rights, Judge Kavanaugh has routinely sided with corporations who want to prevent workers from unionizing. Even at President Trump's own hotel in Atlantic City, which at the time had admitted its refusal to bargain with workers in a 2012 case. When the car dealers across several hotels voted to unionize, Judge Kavanaugh and a panel of judges invalidated the will of the workers, overturned an administrative law judge's ruling that the union be certified, and allowed the Trump Hotel to continue violating workers' rights. On environmental issues, Judge Kavanaugh's record shows that time and again he favors polluters over clean water and clean air. With his confirmation, it will be much harder for Americans to seek redress in the courts, and it will be easier for polluters to continue to pollute the environment. As a circuit court judge, he has written 10 dissenting opinions in environmental cases, and in each one, he argued against the side that sought to protect the public health and the environment. Mr. President, Judge Kavanaugh's sweeping view of executive power should cause alarm among every member of this Senate, Republican and Democrat alike. We've all heard the testimony, we've seen the writings, and it appears to be no surprise that President Trump, who is watching that Mueller investigation get closer and closer to his doorstep, that he would want a judge that gives excessive deference to the executive branch. Somebody who may be on the Supreme Court when that court has to decide whether or not President Trump can be subpoenaed in that case or otherwise brought to justice in that case, if that's what the conclusions demand. So, Mr. President, it's clear on all of these issues that President Trump and Republicans had their man in Judge Kavanaugh. They have someone who they believe will overturn the Affordable Care Act, once again giving insurance companies a green light to discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions. They think they've got someone who will overturn Roe v. Wade or dramatically limit a woman's right to reproductive freedom and choice. Someone who will gut environmental regulations, undermine workers' rights and consumer protections, and someone who will give corporations the ability to continue to spend unlimited amounts of money in elections, and who might even argue that the contribution limits to candidates are unconstitutional and can be limited. And finally, someone who the president believes will get him off the hook if the Mueller investigation gets too close to him. So, Mr. President, here we have Republicans in this Senate and a president on the verge of getting someone who they thought could do all those things. And then something unexpected happened. The country learned about what happened to Dr. Ford. Our Republican colleagues seem to have forgotten that Dr. Ford did not want to come forward publicly to report her sexual assault. It was only when she found out that Judge Kavanaugh was on the second short list that was released that she became concerned. Even then, she didn't want to come forward publicly, but she thought it was her civic duty to let people know what had happened to her. And so she reached out to her representative in Congress on a confidential basis. The story did become public. And when it did, she felt duty-bound to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee and tell senators what happened to her on that awful day. We all know she had nothing to gain. She has been subjected to all sorts of awful death threats and other kinds of verbal abuse. Nothing to gain, everything to lose. And our Republican senators who listened to her testimony, for the most part, said that her testimony was both powerful and credible. We know she answered questions directly. By contrast, Judge Kavanaugh's testimony was partisan, it was evasive, and on many points, even under oath, untruthful. When the female prosecutor that Republicans hired to ask questions for them could not discredit Dr. Ford's testimony, we saw many of our Republican colleagues launch into full partisan attack mode. No longer did the facts matter. They picked up on Judge Kavanaugh's opening statement about partisanship rather than seeking to get to the truth about what happened to Dr. Ford and others who have alleged sexual assault. What mattered was ramming through their nominee. The majority leader, Senator McConnell, said, quote, "They'll plow right through," unquote. And by God, nothing was going to stop them. They even scheduled the vote on Judge Kavanaugh before they had heard the testimony about sexual abuse and sexual assault from Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh. It was only when Senator Flake recognized what a sham the process was that he at least forced the Republican leadership to do what they did not want to do and agree to a short FBI investigations into the allegations of Dr. Ford and Deborah Ramirez. But the goal never changed. The goal of ramming through the nomination never changed. And that's why Senate Republicans in the White House dramatically limited the scope of the FBI investigation. They tied the hands of the FBI. They told the FBI who they could interview. An investigation that was already going to be short at about a week was cut even shorter and was finished up in a matter of days. And what's the result, Mr. President? The result is completely predictable. The result is we have lots of key witnesses that say they have corroborating evidence to support the allegations of Dr. Ford and Deborah Ramirez who were not interviewed. And the country will continue to hear from these witnesses after today's vote, because the investigation was orchestrated by the White House and the Senate Republican leadership. The FBI was not allowed to do its full job. Mr. President, it would have been better for all parties involved, and I mean all parties, including Judge Kavanaugh, to have had a thorough investigation where at the end of the day, the public could have confidence that all the available evidence had been tracked down and reviewed. That would have been best for the integrity of the court and the integrity of the Senate. And we all know there's no requirement that we rush this confirmation. We all know that. After all, it was the Republican leader who kept a seat open on the Supreme Court for months and months and months after President Obama had nominated Judge Merrick Garland. So this notion that there's some kind of artificial deadline is simply untrue. This is all being done to do, as the majority leader said, plow right through. Because taking time to do the investigation right would have put the entire enterprise at risk, the entire plan to put on the Supreme Court the person who President Trump and Republicans believe will deliver the legal outcomes they want. Even if all the testimony shows he can no longer be impartial, his record and testimony indicate that they will deliver the legal outcomes they want in this case. Now, Mr. President, Dr. Ford's courage in coming forward to tell us what happened to her has empowered many of my Maryland constituents and many others around the country to come forward with their own stories of abuse. I have received written statements from over 50 Marylanders, telling me about the sexual abuse they had encountered. Some of them told me they had shared with me what they have not shared with their own family members. They felt it was important that I know why they did not report their abuse at the time, why they did not tell their parents, why their memories were not perfect decades later. They told me what they do remember. They told me they remember the clothing they wore the day they were assaulted. They tell me they remember the scent, the cologne, the feeling of unwanted hands. Those memories haunt them. These stories are reminders of how our society has let down survivors of sexual assault for decades. The way that these survivors have been treated has been shameful. I'm humbled by the trust they have shown to share these experiences with me, and I will let the stories of a few of them speak for themselves here on the floor of the Senate. Here's what one woman wrote, quote, "Once, when I was 16, I was at a party. There was alcohol. He was popular. I wasn't. He was big and strong. I have never been. He threatened me afterwards. He needn't have bothered. He told me no one would believe me. He told me I wanted it. I showed a friend the bruises. He said everyone would say I was a slut. I told another friend I was frightened. She said I should just avoid him in school. I told an adult I trusted at my job. She told me about how when she reported when she was young, how the police treated her, how her parents reacted, how she regretted saying anything. I never told my parents. I went to a free clinic, and the therapist asked, how could I know it was rape if I had been drinking? Those are the powerful words from one Marylander. Another wrote, quote, I remember the assault vividly. I was on my way home from church. I don't remember the sermon before. Details are fuzzy, but I remember the assault. I remember looking at a nearby home where I knew elderly people lived. I could see that their TV was on, and I wondered, would they even hear me scream? I didn't tell people. I didn't think people would believe me. End of quote. Another constituent wrote me this quickly, without editing. She told me she cried when she read it to her husband. Here's what she wrote, quote, having experience in working with victims in a prosecutorial manner or as a judge, or even defending the accused does not make you an expert. The expert is the victim. I am that victim. I am that expert. And as such, I can tell you absolutely, without hesitation, that what haunts you most, what affects how you relate in the future with your loving spouse, what affects how you feel about yourself, and what affects even your sense of smell, is the memory of the person who abused you. Not the address where it took place, not the time on the clock, not the day of the week, but the smell of the person assaulting you, the feel of their hands, the confusion in your head, because you don't know what's happening, because it's all happening so fast. And yes, their name. You never forget their name. She went on to say, quote, "Then comes the shame. What did I do to cause this? What will people think of me now because I've been touched? I've been tarnished. Will I be believed? At this point, my life has already been altered beyond repair, but it's an internal alter. If I talk, it alters my external world as well. Maybe it's better to just not talk, because then at least I can pretend things are as they have always been. I can just pretend that I'm exactly the same person, but I'm not." End of that passage. Another wrote that she understood that a man could move on from assaulting a woman, particularly if they were drunk at the time. She said, and I quote, "The man who assaulted me later acted as if he was catching up with an old friend and had no memory of the event. I have several friends who have experienced the same thing." End quote. Another echoed a similar experience, writing, quote, "He had been drinking heavily with friends at a restaurant or bar. I had not. Later that night, he raped me. He was very inebriated and displayed a complete personality change. He was violent and angry and did not even seem to see me. I was paralyzed and probably saved my own life by not fighting back, as he had essentially become a rabid animal. The next day, I confronted him about what had happened, and he had no memory of the crime he committed." End quote. Mr. President, these are not isolated incidents for survivors. As I said, I've gotten over 50 personal testimonials from survivors since Dr. Ford had the courage to come forward. People who have not shared what happened to them with some of their closest friends or family members. These are stains etched in their memories. Many of them, as I said, never told a soul. Others were ignored or dismissed when they brought these awful experiences up. They were told to stay quiet. Mr. President, it's an insult to these survivors when some have called them partisan. And in many cases, they went out of their way in their messages to me to say that their concern had nothing to do with ideology or partisanship. Nothing. Some told me they're Republicans. Others are independents. Some of them grew up at the time were in families that had no care about politics. Others told me they were Democrats, but they'd be more than willing to accept a different conservative judge, but not this one. Mr. President, when Donald Trump went to a campaign rally and mocked Dr. Ford, he mocked every one of those 50 survivors who wrote to me. He mocked every survivor of sexual abuse around the country. And this Senate's decision to do, as the majority leader said, quote, plow right through without undertaking a thorough and serious investigation into the charges from Dr. Ford, Deborah Ramirez, that also disrespects these survivors. That's what they say to me. And of course, Judge Kavanaugh did the same thing in his opening statement at his most recent hearing, because his entire opening statement suggested that Dr. Ford's coming forward was part of some political conspiracy. And unfortunately, that's where this conversation has gone ever since. not an effort to really get to the truth, to really get all the facts, but just to do what the majority leader said before she even testified: plow right through. Mr. President, we know that etched above the Supreme Court are the words "equal justice under law." It does not say "plow right through." Mr. President, the decision to plow right through, will undermine and haunt the integrity of the Supreme Court for decades to come. And it will also haunt and undermine the integrity of this United States Senate. I yield the floor.
The nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. It isn't even over yet, and they want people to believe that what we've witnessed over the past weeks was what they call a political hit job perpetrated by Democrats with a grudge. That's the story the nominee himself tried to sell in his testimony on Thursday. He accused Democrats of lying in wait. He twisted Ranking Member Feinstein's respect for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's wish for privacy. He falsely claimed that Democrats had her accusation ready, that Dr. Ford's accusation was held in secret for weeks because the Democrats, as Judge Kavanaugh put it, couldn't take me out on the merits. What a paranoid fantasy. Brett Kavanaugh's entire performance was an hours-long rant. I'm quoting him. He said, "This whole two-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with apparent pent-up anger about President Trump, stoked about my judicial record, revenge on behalf of the Clintons, and millions of dollars in money from outside left-wing opposition groups." End quote. Unbelievable, in my view. He claimed to have written the screed on his own without showing it to any of his handlers. I find that hard to believe, given that he was reported to have spent 10-hour days at the White House preparing for this hearing. We heard Dr. Ford's raw and sincere account of that night as a drunk teenage Brett Kavanaugh and Mark Judge attacked her. The nominee called it a grotesque and coordinated character assassination. But this isn't a conspiracy, Judge Kavanaugh. It's reality. Look at what Dr. Ford's coming forward has triggered. People believe her for many reasons. Her recall of the events is consistent with the way survivors of trauma remember things. Her demeanor was forthright and open. She had everything to lose and nothing to gain by coming forward. And despite what many are saying, there are quite a bit of collaboration of her story. She knew Brett Kavanaugh. She socialized with his circle of friends. She had told people in her life what happened to her long before Brett Kavanaugh was nominated to the Supreme Court. His calendars attest to his having attended at least one gathering consistent with her recollection. But another reason so many people believe Dr. Ford is that her account is so familiar. It has echoes in so many of our own stories, our own experiences. So many women have survived some version of what happened to her, along a spectrum of experiences that range from creepy looks or catcalls to rape and other violent attacks. So many women have kept their stories to themselves for fear of not being believed, for fear of retaliation or humiliation or shunning. In a column written by Monica Hess in the Washington Post entitled, "Dear Dads, your daughters told me about their assaults. This is why they never told you." Ms. Hess writes about all the reasons why survivors don't even tell the people closest to them about what happened to them. She writes, quote, "For all the stereotypes that linger about women being too fragile or emotional, these past weeks have revealed what many women already know. A lot of effort goes into protecting men we love from bad things that happen to us," end quote. She writes to fathers who are only now finding out about the daily indignities women endure and explains why they were never told and why their loved ones were now writing to Hess herself. I am going to quote extensively from Ms. Hess's article. Quote, "To the father of the young woman who was assaulted by the student athlete she was hired to tutor, she never told you because she didn't want to break your heart, but she told me in a long email because the memory of it was breaking her own heart, and she spent 5 years replaying it. To the father of the junior high student who was pinned down and undressed at a gathering 30 years ago, she didn't tell you because she didn't want to see you cry, but she told me that she still remembers every detail. To the father of the teenager who was raped at a party, you don't know about this because she was certain that if you knew, you would kill her attacker and go to prison, and it would be her fault. To the father of the son who was assaulted by an older man, I wish I could tell you more about what happened to him, but he wouldn't tell me, and he definitely won't tell you because manliness is important to you," he says. To all the fathers of all the silent victims, your children are quietly carrying these stories, not because they can't handle their emotions, but because they are worried that you can't. They're worried that your emotions will have too many consequences, or they fear you won't think of them the same way, or that you'll be distraught because you didn't protect them, end quote. These words and stories are powerful, and Ms. Hess is right. So many survivors want to protect their loved ones, but Ms. Hess is also right that they shouldn't keep their stories in. She urges them, saying, and again I quote, "So to the rest of you, if you can tell your father in a way that feels safe, in a way that would bring you comfort, tell your father, tell your brothers. Let them be uncomfortable. Let them share some of your pain. Don't let them be ignorant," end quote. And once women are able to share their experiences, what should we do with them? I agree with the author, Rebecca Traister, who captured so much of what I have been thinking lately in a piece called "Fury is a Political Weapon and Women Need to Wield It" in the New York Times. I want to read some of it to you. Ms. Traister wrote, quote, "Outside the room where Christine Blasey Ford was testifying on Thursday morning, women were incandescent with rage and sorrow and horror. They were getting angry in a new way, a public way, an unapologetic way, a way that is typically reserved for men and that would again serve men well when afternoon came. Brett Kavanaugh bellowed, he snarled, he pouted, and wept furiously at the injustice of having his ascendance to power interrupted by accusations of sexual assault. He challenged his questioners, turned their queries back on them. What happened inside the room was an exceptionally clear distillation of who has historically been allowed to be angry on their own behalf and who has not. And outside the room was a hint of how it might be changing. Most of the time, female anger is discouraged, repressed, ignored, swallowed, or transformed into something more palatable and less recognizable as fury, something like tears. When women are truly livid, they often weep. Maybe we cry when we're furious, in part because we feel a kind of grief of all the things we want to say or yell that we know we can't. Maybe we're just sad about the very same things that we're angry about. I wept as soon as Dr. Blasey began to speak. On social media, I saw hundreds of messages from women who reported the same experience of finding themselves awash in tears simply in response to this woman's voice raised in polite dissent. The power of the moment, the anxiety that it would be futile, the grief that we even had to put her and ourselves through this spectacle was intense. Tears are permitted as an outlet for wrath, in part because they are fundamentally misunderstood. One of my sharpest memories from an early job in a male-dominated office where I once found myself weeping with an inexpressible rage was my being grabbed by the scruff of my neck by an older woman, a chilly manager of whom I'd always been slightly terrified, who dragged me into a stairwell. "Never let them see you crying," she told me. "They don't know you're furious. They think you're sad and will be pleased because they got to you." This political moment has provoked a period in which more and more women have been in no mood to dress their fury up as anything other than raw and burning rage. Many women are yelling, shouting, using Sharpies to etch sharply worded slogans onto protest signs, making furious phone calls to representatives. Many of the women shouting now are women who have not previously yelled publicly before. Many of them white middle-class women newly awakened to political fury and protest. Part of the process of becoming mad must be recognizing that they are not the first to be furious and that there is much to learn from the stories and histories of the livid women, many of them not white or middle class, who have never had reason not to be mad. If you are angry today, or if you have been angry for a while, and you're wondering whether you're allowed to be as angry as you feel, let me say, yes, you are allowed. You are, in fact, compelled. If you've been feeling a new rage at the flaws of this country, and if your anger is making you want to change your life in order to change the world, then I have something incredibly important to say. Don't forget how this feels, end quote. That's Rebecca Traister's article. Traister ends her article by endorsing anger and telling women not to let go of it. She says, what you're angry about now, injustice, will still exist, even if you yourself are not experiencing it or are tempted to stop thinking about how you experience it and how you contribute to it. Others are still experiencing it, still mad. Some of them are mad at you. Don't forget them. Don't write off their anger. Stay mad for them, alongside them. Let them lead you in anger, end quote. That's what I am left with, Mr. President. Anger, fury, disgust at a process that could not see the truth of what Dr. Ford tried to tell us. The rewriters of truth are already at it. In column after column, on cable's news shows across the country, even here on the Senate floor, they are casting Judge Kavanaugh as the victim. I was asked a few days ago whether the 4 Democratic women on the Judiciary Committee had a special responsibility to address the question of sexual assault. I reject the premise of that question. It's not just up to the women in this country to stand up. Men have to join us. They have to hold themselves and other men accountable. They have to push back against the fear that those with power feel when they are challenged. And we saw some of the ways that this kind of fear operates just this week among some of my Senate colleagues. When approached by survivors of sexual assault who waited to talk to them about the Kavanaugh nomination, they said things like, "grow up," and insinuating that the women sharing their painful, traumatic accounts were there to enjoy themselves. Enjoy themselves? We saw the President of the United States sink to a level I didn't think possible. The mocker-in-chief mocked Dr. Ford, a survivor of sexual assault. He mocked her for not remembering some peripheral things about the attack. But the thing she said she was 100% sure of was that it was Brett Kavanaugh who attacked her. In case some of my colleagues don't get it, sexual assault survivors often don't remember how many steps, how many rooms, the kinds of things the president mocked Dr. Ford about. But they remember the attack itself with 100% accuracy. They remember how it felt, the fear, the laughter of the attackers. The kinds of insults that have been hurled at Dr. Ford and others in her situation are cruel and unnecessary. Mr. President, I'm left with anger and determination, just like millions of people across the country. I will take Rebecca Tracer's advice and commend it to the women of America and the men who understand their stories. I will stay mad and let that anger propel us to change. Going forward, I will continue to listen to women who have shared their stories. I will tell them I hear them, that I see them, and that I want all of us to be the change that needs to happen in our country. Mr. President, before I yield the floor, I want to read a statement from Debbie Ramirez, dated October 6, 2018, and she says, 35 years ago, the other students in the room chose to laugh and look the other way as sexual violence was perpetuated on me by Brett Kavanaugh. As I watch many of the senators speak and vote on the floor of the Senate, I feel like I'm right back at Yale, where half the room is laughing and looking the other way. Only this time, instead of drunk college kids, it is you as senators who are deliberately ignoring his behavior. This is how victims are isolated and silenced. But I do have corroborating witnesses speaking for me, although they were not allowed to speak to the FBI, and I feel extremely grateful for them and for the overwhelming amount of support that I have received and continue to receive during this extremely difficult and painful time. There may be people with power who are looking the other way, but there are millions more who are standing together, speaking up about personal experiences of sexual violence and taking action to support survivors. This is truly a collective moment of survivors and allies standing together. Thank you for hearing me, seeing me, and believing me. I am grateful for each and every one of you. We will not be silenced. We stand in truth and light. Debbie Ramirez. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, why don't I thank the distinguished senator from Hawaii for her comments. She has had a strong voice of reason and conscience throughout this whole debate. President, this is not a normal confirmation vote. I've now served in the Senate for 19 Supreme Court nominations, more than any other senator. I've never seen so much at stake with a single seat. And I've never seen this much at stake precisely because this is about more than one seat. Indeed, the integrity of two of the three co-equal branches of our republic is at stake. This vote will decide whether the United States Senate, which at its best can serve as the conscience of the nation, causes the Supreme Court to be indelibly tainted in the eyes of millions of Americans, perhaps more than half the country. And to be clear, my opposition to Judge Kavanaugh is not because he was nominated by a Republican president. In my 44 years in the Senate, I have voted for more Republican-appointed judges than almost every single Republican senator serving today. And that includes, of course, voting to confirm Chief Justice John Roberts. But Judge Kavanaugh is not a typical conservative nominee. My opposition is driven by my firm belief that his confirmation would bring great harm to the court, and to this body, and to millions of hardworking Americans. Judge Kavanaugh has been relentlessly dishonest under oath. I'm not just referring to the fact that he's not telling the truth about his high school drinking, or the obvious misogyny in his yearbook, or whether he's Brett Kavanaugh who passed out from drunkenness. All of that, of course, does speak to his credibility, as he concocted far-fetched story after far-fetched story, all to avoid conceding facts that would corroborate the Brett Kavanaugh as described by Dr. Ford and Ms. Ramirez. But it's much more than that, much, much more than that. Every single time Judge Kavanaugh has testified before the Senate, in 2004, in 2006, twice in 2018, he's misled, he's dissembled. On issues both big and small, anytime he's been faced with questions that are incriminating or place him in the middle of a controversy, he's shown he cannot be trusted to tell the truth. He misled the Senate following questions by both Republicans and Democrats. He misled the Senate about his role in a hacking scandal and thefts from the United States Senate. He misled the Senate about his role in confirming several controversial judicial nominees, and in shaping the legal justifications for some of the Bush administration's most extreme and eventually discredited policies. I've never seen a nominee so casually willing to evade and deny the truth in service of his own raw ambition. For decades, that ambition has led him step after step evade the truth if it's in any way going to stop his ambitions. And the truth is, we're just beginning to learn about Judge Kavanaugh's dishonesty under oath. His false testimony during his 2004 and 2006 confirmation hearings only came to light as the Judiciary Committee obtained some of his White House emails. Some, because Senate Republicans blocked access to 90% of his White House record. I compare that to when Justice Kagan was here. We made sure that Republicans and Democrats had 99% of her record and briefed on the remaining 1%. Here, 90% was blocked. So everything we've learned about his prior dishonesty comes from just 10% of his record. Now, many more of these records are eventually going to become public after today. In fact, I joined a lawsuit led by Senator Blumenthal to force the National Archives to release these records. So if 10% of his records show dishonesty, what are the chances that the other 90% do not contain additional evidence of Judge Kavanaugh's dishonesty under oath? I'd say the chances are about zero. And it's not just Judge Kavanaugh's veracity that's disqualifying. It's also his temperament, his partisan zeal. When Brett Kavanaugh was nominated to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in 2004, he was known only as a hyper-partisan political operative. Because he was seen as so hyper-political, it took 2 years to get him confirmed. And since Judge Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court, I'd wondered whether his earlier partisan zeal that held him up for 2 years whether that has remained. Well, it was confirmed last week that it does remain. I have never seen a nominee of either Republican or Democrat so consumed by partisan rancor. In testimony that veered into a tirade, he angrily attacked senators, dismissed Dr. Ford's testimony as part of a smear campaign to ruin his name and sink his nomination. His conspiratorial ramblings, attributing the allegations to revenge on behalf of the Clintons, wherever that came from, were an insult to Dr. Ford and to survivors of sexual violence everywhere. And it's not helped that his patron, the President of the United States, continues to deride victims of sexual violence. Former Justice John Paul Stevens, a Republican appointee, actually the first nominee I was able to vote on as a United States Senator, and I voted for him. This Republican appointee, well-respected Supreme Court justice, declared that Judge Kavanaugh's unhinged performance last week demonstrates potential bias. Justice Stevens said that for the good of the court, Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation ought not to proceed. Just yesterday, contrary to the statements made on the floor of the Senate, the American Bar Association announced that it's reopening its evaluation of Judge Kavanaugh's fitness to serve as a judge. These developments, both unprecedented, should serve as a flashing red warning sign to any senator inclined to vote yes at this time. And there are more flashing red signs. Dr. Ford's credible and compelling testimony captivated the nation, inspired survivors of sexual violence across the country. Every minute of her testimony was credible. She disclosed the abuse long before Judge Kavanaugh was a household name. She remembered vivid details of that night. She expressed 100% certainty that Judge Kavanaugh was her abuser. In a moment that I'll never forget, when I asked her, "Doctor, what is your strongest memory?" Something from the incident she could not forget. She testified, "Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, the uproarious laughter between the two as a teenage Brett Kavanaugh and a friend drunkenly assaulted Dr. Ford." Dr. Ford had nothing to gain by coming forward. I believe her just as I believed Anita Hill. In my view, no one who truly believes Dr. Ford can credibly justify voting yes. But unfortunately, the Senate appears to be on the brink of failing Dr. Ford, just as it will fail Ms. Ramirez, and just as it failed Anita Hill. The FBI investigation completed over the last few days falls short of any standard. And it fell short by design. We've already heard about the deficiencies from Dr. Ford, Ms. Ramirez, and numerous other witnesses who attempted unsuccessfully to share relevant information with the FBI. But the FBI were told by the Senate Republican leadership in the White House that this should not be a full investigation. The Senate Republican leadership in the White House did everything in their power to ensure that this investigation was not a search for truth, but rather a search for cover. Even a basic search for the truth would have allowed the FBI to interview Judge Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford, as well as her husband and her therapist. A search for truth would have allowed the FBI to interview numerous high school and college classmates who have come forward saying they could provide information about Judge Kavanaugh's conduct during those years that was consistent with the allegations. A search for the truth would have allowed the FBI to interview a man who wrote a sworn statement asserting that he could corroborate Ms. Ramirez's allegations, or two women who contacted authorities with evidence that Judge Kavanaugh tried to head off Ms. Ramirez's story before it became public. That was in clear contradiction with his testimony before the Judiciary Committee. A search for the truth would have allowed the FBI to at least speak with Julie Swetnick, a third accuser. As Vermonters said to me last weekend when I was home, if they have nothing to hide, why the rush? If they have nothing to hide, why don't they take the time to find the whole truth? But instead of calling on the FBI to take these basic investigatory steps, inexplicably, the Republican-controlled Judiciary Committee has solely tried to discredit these women. The committee released a statement from a former acquaintance of Ms. Swetnick. This individual had no knowledge of the alleged incident, but instead wanted to describe the alleged sexual preferences of Ms. Swetnick. According to the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, one of the most nonpartisan and respected voices on Capitol Hill, the shameless attempt to smear a victim violates the intent of the Rape Shield law. Look what happened. On the one hand, you have the President of the United States at a rally trying to shame the victim, who of course is a woman. And then we have, on the other hand, Ms. Swetnick was never even interviewed by the FBI. She was ignored. She was silenced. And then, to follow the routine of this administration, she was shamed. It's outrageous she's been treated that way. Republicans have also claimed that the other individuals Dr. Ford identified at the gathering where she was assaulted have refuted her testimony. These Republicans know that's just false. Those individuals stated publicly they do not recall the event. As Dr. Ford told the Judiciary Committee, this is not surprising. It's a very unremarkable party, because nothing remarkable happened to them that evening. But one of these individuals has said publicly she believes Dr. Ford. Republicans have claimed the investigation failed to reveal corroborating evidence for any of these allegations. But despite the numerous restrictions placed on this investigation, that simply is not true. But a predicate fact for developing thorough corroborating evidence is a thorough investigation. And this investigation fell far short. When I was a prosecutor, I never would have allowed an investigation that left out so many salient points. It's a disservice to Dr. Ford, to Ms. Ramirez, to Ms. Swetnick, but it's a disservice to survivors everywhere. The manic rush to place Judge Kavanaugh on the bench was more important to many in the Senate than these women. Pushing toward confirmation while so many leads remain unexamined is forever going to taint Justice Kavanaugh and, unfortunately, the Supreme Court itself. Yes, truth can be dogged. It has a way of coming out eventually. And for any senator who votes yes, while troubling new developments in this nominee are occurring in real time, it's going to be on their conscience when more disqualifying information later emerges, and it will. I urge them to think carefully about what a yes vote would mean to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, to the integrity of the Senate, to the increasing divisiveness in our nation. As partisan as this process has been, this is not a partisan dilemma. Many prominent conservatives would make a fine Supreme Court justice. And as I said at the beginning of my speech, I voted for more Republican nominees than almost any Republican senator in this body. But these other people would not cast a shadow over the Supreme Court and a shadow over the United States Senate along with it. Judge Kavanaugh is not that choice. To avoid risking permanent damage to the integrity of our institutions of government, I urge senators, join me in voting no on Judge Kavanaugh's nomination. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator for Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. We come together today to talk about a critical nomination to the United States Supreme Court at a time when the court will be considering a range of issues that are critically important to the American people. Right now, one of the issues that a lot of Americans are most concerned about is the issue of health care. So many aspects to that issue that we can examine today. I'll get to larger overriding concerns I have with the nomination in a moment, but for now, what I'll do is walk through some concerns I have when it comes to health care itself, and in particular, Americans with disabilities. Because I think this part of the debate, in this part of Judge Kavanaugh's record, and the potential impact that his decisions as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court could have on health care itself and people with disabilities, this whole part of his record and what might happen has been maybe not unexamined, but not examined enough in this debate. I'll start with health care. If Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed today, he could be the deciding vote in eliminating key health care protections for people with pre-existing conditions, an action that would have serious repercussions on the health care of millions of Americans. This administration and congressional Republicans have been trying for the better part of the last 2 years to rip away health care coverage from the people who need it the most across America. Republicans in both branches of government, the executive branch and the legislative branch, have attempted to decimate Medicaid, and although they've been unable so far to fully repeal the Affordable Care Act here in Congress, the Republicans have turned to the courts to sabotage the health care system and the Affordable Care Act. And by the way, while we're mentioning the Medicaid program, let's remind the American people what that program is. The Medicaid program is not a them program, it's an us program. It's about us, who we are as Americans, whether or not we're going to take care of the family of America. And I think my home state is representative of the impact that Medicaid has on people across the country. 40% of the children in Pennsylvania get their health care through the Medicaid program. 50% of the people with disabilities in Pennsylvania rely upon Medicaid. And 60% of seniors trying to get into a nursing home for long-term care in the twilight of their lives rely upon the Medicaid program. 40% of the kids, 50% of people with disabilities, and 60% of seniors rely upon this program. Some 70 million Americans. So the decisions by this Congress or this body and the entire legislative branch are critically important on Medicaid and health care. Obviously, the decisions of the executive branch, but now we have to focus as well on the judicial branch, especially with a nomination that could tip the balance in 5-4 decisions. Judge Kavanaugh has twice disagreed with rulings upholding the Affordable Care Act. It's no coincidence he's been nominated by this president, by this administration. President Trump apparently believes he can count on Justice Kavanaugh, were he to be confirmed, to rule against the Affordable Care Act when he is on the Supreme Court, if he were to be confirmed today. And you don't take my word for this. A former law clerk of Judge Kavanaugh said it best when she spoke about Judge Kavanaugh's view of the Affordable Care Act. Quote, this is from a law clerk, "No other contender on President Trump's list is on record so vigorously opposing the law," unquote. The law meaning the Affordable Care Act that brought health care to 20 million Americans, about more than half of them because we expanded Medicaid. Right now, courts are considering whether people with pre-existing conditions should continue to be protected from being charged more, from being denied coverage, or being dropped from their insurance simply because of their health status. Who would ever believe that after putting into law, enacting into law those protections for 130 million Americans, who would ever believe we'd still be debating it? And that an entire political party would be in a court of law arguing that those protections are unconstitutional. It's an insult to who we are as Americans. In Texas versus the United States, the administration has sided with 20 Republican state attorneys general and is refusing to defend the Affordable Care Act's protections for people with pre-existing conditions. So what's at stake in this legal battle that could end up, obviously, down the road in the Supreme Court? It is 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions. And that means people with diabetes or cancer or anything else that's a pre-existing condition could have their lives grossly, adversely impacted. The Supreme Court might be the last line of defense to maintaining those protections for people with pre-existing conditions. And a Justice Kavanaugh could be the deciding vote to rip away protections which are in law now, right now, and they could be taken away. If Republicans were to win this fight, coverage for millions of Americans who have these protections would be adversely impacted. That's probably an understatement. We also have to be concerned about the fundamentals of our health insurance system, the fundamental stability of our healthcare system, which could be undermined or worse. Such a decision by the Supreme Court would have real-life consequences. In Pennsylvania alone, 5.3 million people, including 643,000 children, have a pre-existing condition. I'll tell you the story of one of those children, Jackson Corbin, 13 years old, Hanover, Pennsylvania. He lives with his mother, Anna, his father, Michael, and his brother, Henry. Jackson, Henry, and their mom all have Noonan syndrome, a congenital disability that often involves heart attacks, bleeding problems, possible developmental delays, short stature, and malformation of the rib cage. All of that in the life of one child. Jackson's most troubling concern is a form of hemophilia called von Willebrand disease. And because of this disease, he has to be very careful not to cut himself or to do things that might cause internal bleeding. This means that Jackson cannot play sports, he cannot roller skate or even jump on a trampoline. The cost of his health care, including medications and treatments and specialists, is more than what his parents would make in a year. In a year. Without health insurance coverage that they are able to purchase through the Affordable Care Act, including protections for pre-existing conditions, the Corbin family would either go bankrupt or Jackson and his mother and his brother would have to go without treatment, of course, risking their lives. Last month, Jackson testified in front of the Judiciary Committee and spoke about what Judge Kavanaugh's nomination meant for him, for Jackson Corbin. Quote, "My Noonan syndrome is part of who I am. It's been a part of me since the day I was born and will be a part of me for the rest of my life. If you destroy protections for pre-existing conditions, you will leave me and all the kids and adults like me without care and without the ability to afford our care, all because of who we are," unquote. Let me repeat those last few words of Jackson Corbin, 13 years old. Quote, "Without care or without the ability to afford our care," unquote. That's what we're talking about here. Judge Kavanaugh could very well be the deciding vote in determining the future of this child and the future of members of his family. all of us, everybody in this building today, are just one illness. Each of us is just one injury away from having our own pre-existing condition, if we don't have one already. Maybe senators and judges and justices don't have to worry about protections for pre-existing conditions. Maybe they can all buy that protection one way or another. But 130 million Americans have to worry, and have to worry about this consequential nomination on an issue of such grave importance as health care itself, and maybe most especially protections for people with pre-existing conditions. How about disabilities? Judge Kavanaugh's record on the rights of individuals with disabilities is troubling as well. I'll give you one example. Liz Weintraub, who, like Jackson, testified in front of the Judiciary Committee in opposition to Judge Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. I know Liz Weintraub well. She's 51 years old. She's from Rockville, Maryland. She has cerebral palsy and intellectual disability. She has had 2 loving parents and 3 loving sisters. And for 4 months this year, she was on my staff as a legislative fellow. So I'm not objective when it comes to Liz Weintraub. But here's what she told us. And the work she did, of course, on our staff was significant. She helped organize hearings and worked on disability issues to educate our office and me, as well as other Senate offices, about the importance of hiring people with disabilities. But Liz experienced low expectations in her life. She was told by educators she could never attend college. She spent 9 years in a private institution. She was told she had to work in a sheltered workshop. Despite these barriers, Liz persevered and achieved her dream of being a disability policy advocate. Her knowledge, experience, and wisdom made my office a better place on these issues and a better place to work. It strengthened our office's ability to work on disability policy. Let's get to the judge's record on these issues. Judge Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit shows a pattern of siding against individuals with disabilities. He has sided with employers over employees who have a disability, making it more difficult for employers to prove discrimination in court and have their rights protected under the law. And in a case called Doe versus D.C., he called into question the very autonomy and right to self-determination of people with disabilities. The case involved 3 women who had intellectual disabilities and lived in facilities run by the District of Columbia. The district allowed medical professionals to decide when elective surgeries would be performed on these women without even consulting with them and without even trying to determine the wishes of these 3 women. The trial court sided with the women in this case and said that the District of Columbia had to attempt to determine what these women wanted before making medical decisions on their behalf. Judge Kavanaugh overturned the lower court decision. He questioned the basic liberty of individuals with disabilities. He allowed the government to continue making medical decisions on their behalf, these 3 women in the District of Columbia, without ever attempting to determine what they wanted. This decision is offensive to the American people, but it's offensive, I think, to people with disabilities even more so. People who have fought for decades to secure the rights of people with disabilities. The decision robbed these women of their autonomy, and it robbed them of their humanity. As Liz Weintraub said in her testimony, I worry that if a justice on the Supreme Court does not believe that we, as people with intellectual disabilities, can make decisions for ourselves, then we will have the right to make those decisions taken away from us. Quote, that is why I'm opposing Judge Kavanaugh, unquote. These are the words of Liz Weintraub speaking for many Americans with disabilities. I want to thank Liz for her testimony and for coming forward to speak on behalf of those Americans. These decisions about these rights for people with disabilities don't just impact the individuals in the particular lawsuit, they also set a precedent for future cases and send a message about the values of our country, about whose rights we consider worthy of protection. If our courts don't protect the rights and dignity of people with disabilities, then what are our courts there for? We have to ask that question. Mr. President, I want to conclude with just a couple of more comments. There's been a lot of debate and a lot of commentary and a lot of vigorous disagreement about the back and forth that occurred just last week. But I think I'm like many Americans who say I believe Dr. Ford's testimony. I thought she was both credible and persuasive. And I wrote the following earlier this week in an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer dated October 2nd, quote, in describing part of her testimony, the details of a sexual assault she experienced as a 15-year-old, that made an impression on Americans, of course. And then I went on to say the terror she felt in that moment, the horror of the physical assault, and the psychological trauma of believing she might die, unquote. I believe that testimony, and that alone is troubling enough when it comes to making a determination on this nomination. I was further concerned when I listened to the testimony of Judge Kavanaugh, concerned about his lack of judicial temperament. I think that's an understatement in that moment, and also whether or not he could be an impartial justice based upon what he said in response to the allegations, and especially what he was saying about Democrats in the Senate. So I will vote no for several reasons, many of them outlined with regard to health care and disability policy. I will vote no on this nomination, and I urge my colleagues to vote no as well. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The Majority Whip.
Mr. President, in a few moments, we will vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. It is time. Justice Gorsuch and Justice Sotomayor were confirmed 66 days after they were nominated. Today marks the 90th day since President Trump nominated Judge Kavanaugh. So this is in line with the time frame for previous justices. What is different, though, about this nomination is the manifest unfairness in the way it was conducted and in the tone and behavior of some senators, as well as the special interest groups that support them. This institution used to be known as the world's greatest deliberative body, but you wouldn't know it now on this nomination. The senator from Maine said yesterday that we have hit rock bottom when it comes to the judicial confirmation process, and sadly, I agree. This, despite the heroic efforts of Senator Grassley, who along with his staff have been magnificent as chairman of the Judiciary Committee. What precipitated this embarrassing period for the Senate was the intentional and deliberate withholding of Dr. Ford's allegations from the Judiciary Committee and Judge Kavanaugh until the 11th hour, and then publicly ambushing everyone else concerned. It has been a process that, in words that echo from another dark period for the Senate, the McCarthy hearings, it has been cruel, reckless, and indecent, both to Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh. Still, despite these hijinks and the weaponization of the confirmation process, we've bent over backwards to try to accommodate Dr. Ford once she said she wanted to come before the committee. We know she requested confidentiality as her allegations were investigated. She did not consent to nor authorize the release of her letter. She didn't want a public spectacle. Judiciary Committee staff even offered to fly to California on a bipartisan basis and interview her confidentially. But this offer was not even shared with her by her partisan lawyers. In other words, she said she never understood that offer was on the table. She thought the only way she could tell her story is in the midst of the three-ring circus that hearing became. But after Dr. Ford, the damage to her was done, When her identity became known, we invited Dr. Ford to testify. She came and did so, and I respect and admire her courage. It could not have been easy. We listened respectfully to her story. We took it very seriously. We treated her the same way we would want our wives or daughters to be treated. And we tried to learn the facts, cold, hard facts, as elicited by an expert in dealing with sexual assault cases. We all know that after the hearing, what that attorney told us, because it became public. She said as a prosecutor, she would never recommend charges under these circumstances because, in her view, there was no corroboration of Dr. Ford's account. And there were inconsistencies in her story regarding the place, the time, and the people involved in relevant events. In other words, this was not a case of he said, she said. It was a case of she said, they said, including everyone Dr. Ford claimed was a witness. Not only no corroboration, the alleged witnesses refuted her claim, including her best friend, Leland Kaiser, who said she never met Brett Kavanaugh. Then, even after all of that, even after hiding information that should have been shared confidentially with the Judiciary Committee, even after the outrageous conduct by some senators at the first hearing, intentionally violating committee rules and seeking delay after delay, even after that, we took another additional step to address any lingering concerns. The FBI launched a supplemental background investigation. There are two words to note about this investigation: supplemental and independent. Supplemental because Judge Kavanaugh has had 6 other previous background investigations. This was the 7th. Independent because now opponents are saying that, well, the investigation was merely checking a box. It wasn't thorough or comprehensive enough. But that simply doesn't jive with the facts. The FBI was told to investigate current credible allegations, and they had a free rein to contact anyone they wanted. And they contacted many of the people that our Democratic colleagues, Dr. Ford and Ms. Ramirez themselves, said were eyewitnesses or persons with relevant knowledge. I'm talking about folks like Mark Judge and others. So opponents are trying to have it both ways: demand an investigation, but then badmouth it when it doesn't reveal what they hoped it would. Politics should not have and didn't dictate the terms of this supplemental background investigation. The FBI knows how to do its work, and now opponents of this nomination should accept its findings. But, Mr. President, this has never been a search for the truth by senators who had already announced their opposition to this nomination, some of them even before Judge Kavanaugh was named. Rather, it has become a matter of delay, defeat, and destroy. I do believe the senator from Arizona and others who joined in his request did us a great favor by insisting on the FBI supplemental background investigation. The American people can feel better that leads have been followed and exhausted for those still interested in a search for the facts. The American people now know that we took it upon ourselves to take one last step to dispel the doubts about Judge Kavanaugh's fitness to serve on the highest court in the land. And that step is now complete. So to Senators Flake, Collins, and others who requested that supplemental background investigation, I say thank you. Both Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh have been badly treated throughout this process. Dr. Ford has been treated less as a real person than as a poker chip in a card game. Her wishes for confidentiality were ignored, her letter was leaked, and her story was weaponized in a political ambush. This whole charade, sad charade, has likewise been unfair to Judge Kavanaugh. These allegations could and should have been investigated by the committee under normal procedures and timelines designed to protect both the accuser and the accused. Instead, we got mob rule. Some blame Judge Kavanaugh for his righteous indignation and impassioned defense at a second hearing. But as somebody who served for 13 years on the bench myself, I know the difference between deciding a case as a judge, for which Judge Kavanaugh's temperament has been universally praised, and defending oneself against character assassination and personal destruction. Judge Kavanaugh understands the difference too, and I have no doubt whatsoever about his judicial temperament. But imagine what this has been like for Judge Kavanaugh's parents, for his wife, for his children, for the friends and colleagues who know the real Brett Kavanaugh. Shocking or embarrassing doesn't begin to describe it. I am disappointed, more than I can say, at those who have unleashed these unjustified attacks on the judge and his family, and disappointed in their lack of any empathy or remorse for what they have put them through. No empathy, no remorse, none. For some of them, it seems that the end justifies the means. Chew good people up, spit them out, no problem, all in a day's work. After the dust settles on this dark period, we need to think about the damage all of this has done to the Senate as an institution and to the judicial confirmation process that we most certainly will embark upon again in the near future. It is my hope, it is my prayer that the politics of personal destruction simply because you don't agree with the nominee's judicial philosophy or the president that nominated him or her will stop. The low road is not available to us anymore because there is no lower road than the one we have been on. It's my hope that some of the tactics we've seen, intimidation, bullying, violating the rules, taunting members, trying to coerce them through bribes, carpet bombing them with TV ads, sending them coat hangers in the mail, screaming at them in the hallway. These cannot become the new normal. And so we cannot reward those tactics. I guarantee that if these tactics had succeeded in blocking Judge Kavanaugh, they would become the new normal. And that ought to chasten all of us. I hope we've learned a painful lesson these last few weeks and will strive to do better. I pledge my good faith and best efforts to do so, to try to help. We should recall the not-so-distant past when Ruth Ginsburg, the former general counsel of the American Civil Liberties Union, was confirmed by a vote of 96-3, when Justice Scalia was confirmed by a vote of 98-0, and John Paul Stevens confirmed by a vote of 98-0 as well. In a rational, logical world, Judge Kavanaugh should have similarly lopsided numbers. That is, if people were willing to get past their tribalism and look at our nominee's record, look at the more than 300 opinions he's authored, the decisions he's authored that the Supreme Court has unanimously embraced. If they would look at his scholarship, talk to his former colleagues and law clerks. If opponents were willing to do that honestly and thoroughly, they would have found a brilliant individual who cuts no corners in his legal analysis, who lets the chips fall where they may, and respects the very important but limited role of the judiciary in our constitutional system. In my view, a vote against Judge Kavanaugh is an endorsement of the way the opponents have mishandled and abused the confirmation process, as well as the shameful intimidation tactics they've employed. A no vote neglects all that the man is and all that he has accomplished based on unproven accusations about adolescent conduct. It justifies the manipulation and mistreatment of people like Dr. Ford for political gain. It would establish a dangerous precedent and legitimize mob rule, including the presumption of guilt in violation of everything our Constitution.
Has restored order to the galleries. The Senator for Texas.
Mr. President, it would establish a dangerous precedent.
Suspend. As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. The Senator for Texas.
Mr. President, it would establish a dangerous precedent and legitimize mob rule, including the presumption of guilt in violation of everything our Constitution and fundamental notions of fairness stand for. Some say we are a nation divided, but I'm not so pessimistic as some. I actually hope we can all learn. We must learn, I believe, from this cruel, reckless, and indecent episode. But a no vote will not unite us. It will help reward despicable tactics and set a new ugly precedent. It will only encourage the spurning of tradition and the flouting of agreed-upon rules, norms, and process. We should not ignore, we cannot acquiesce in or condone what has happened here.
I tell you all, I want to urge you to continue this fight in every way we can. And that means we are going to put feet on the street. We are going to help those who stand for we, the people of the United States of America. We're going to help those who stand for justice under the law. And we're going to have a blue wave that reverberates all across this country on November 6th. God bless you and thank you. And now, I have with me an incredible hero. So here's what I want to hear in her honor. Resist, persist, vote. Resist, persist, vote. Resist, persist, vote. Resist, persist, vote. Elizabeth Warren.
So let's start with the hard part. This hurts. What the United States Senate is about to do hurts. It hurts every survivor of sexual assault who has been ignored. It hurts every woman who has been told to sit down and shut up. It hurts every person who will be on the losing end of a Kavanaugh swing vote against them and in favor of states that keep American citizens from voting, in favor of corporations that cheat consumers, in favor of gun traffickers, put our children at risk. Yeah, this hurts, but I want to be clear. I am not sorry I got in this fight. And I'll tell you why I'm not sorry. Because when we fight, we get stronger. You bet. I want to remind everyone what this fight has done. We have called out men of privilege and power who protect other men of privilege and power. We have lifted the voices of millions of survivors of sexual assault. We have refused to be the women who sit down and shut up. And we have forged the bond that will make us stronger in the next fight. Yeah, you bet. So look, what's about to happen over in the United States Senate, make no mistake, this is about power. This is about raw, naked power. The people who have power and the people who intend that no one else will get that power. So here's how I see it. Yeah, this hurts. No doubt, this hurts. But now is the time to turn our hurt into power. Are you ready? So I got a plan. Right now I call it a 30-day plan. And yeah, oh yeah, you got that. A 30-day plan, and here's that plan. Show them what matters. A 30-day plan. Take back the Senate. Take back the House. Vote Democrat up and down. And return power to the people where it belongs. Fight I ever could have hoped for, my senator from Massachusetts, Ed Markey.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We thank you all for being here on this historic day. What is the one message that we are going to send from here today? The message is, we will remember in November. We will not forget what is happening here today. They have not allowed any senator to see 93% of Brett Kavanaugh's record in the White House. It is Donald Trump and the Republican leadership have conducted a cover-up of Brett Kavanaugh's record in the White House. They have conducted a cover-up of the accusations that have been made about credible witnesses who have information that the FBI should have followed, but Donald Trump and the Republican leadership told the FBI that they must not interview, that they must have a cover-up of the personal history of Brett Kavanaugh. So whether it be his political history or his personal history, the Republicans have engaged in a cover-up so that they can ramrod Brett Kavanaugh onto the Supreme Court of the United States to accomplish a goal which Donald Trump said that the Republicans were going to accomplish, that they were going to name someone to the Supreme Court who would overturn Roe versus Wade. They would name someone to the Supreme Court who would overturn the Affordable Care Act. They would name someone to the Supreme Court who would take environmental laws off the books. They were going to name someone to the Supreme Court who would take gun protection laws off of their books. That is what this entire process has been about. But for the Republicans, this is a reckoning. Over the past few weeks, millions of men and women have found their voices, and they have made clear that they will not be coerced back into silence. They overcame fear and anguish and bullying to forge a new path in our country. This is a nation diseased by an epidemic of sexual assault, but sunlight is the best disinfectant, and we will not retreat into the shadows of our country. That day is now over. Our fight has not been in vain. We will use our solidarity to lift up the stories of survivors. No matter how powerful the accused, we will listen. No matter how long it takes, we will demand justice. This is not defeat. This is the beginning of a revolution that is going to take place in this country. And we will remember in November there is coming a revolution at the ballot box that is going to create a balance in this political city. The monopoly of Republican control over this political system is about to come to an end. Let's go! Let's go! 30 days!
Wow! Can you see out there? We've overtaken the entire street behind you. That's the power of the people. And yesterday they told us we couldn't get up there on the Supreme Court steps. Well, guess what? It's the People's Court. So there we are. And now I'm happy to introduce to you Nan Aaron, the president of the Alliance for Justice Action Campaign.
Hello, everyone. Thank you oh my goodness. Thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for being here for 30 days. Thank you to survivors, and thank you to the over 70 organizations around the country putting together actions just like today. We're huge, really grateful. I want to talk about the Supreme Court. 40 years ago, a group of Republicans decided that they would put people on the Supreme Court who would turn back all of our rights and freedoms. It was a stealth campaign. But from that time on, this has been a systematic effort to get justices on this Supreme Court who will do just that. Who are these justices? Our Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Sam Alito. How about Neil Gorsuch? Clarence Thomas. And then today, if things go as we think, Brett Kavanaugh will join that court to make a majority. Now, this is a beautiful, beautiful building in front of us. But these 5 justices now have a majority to attack workers' rights, civil rights, women's rights, environment, consumer protection, everything that we Americans care about are up for grabs with this 5-person majority. They will dismantle our institutions, our democracy, our voting rights, and we cannot let them do that. After this fight, we cannot go home. We have to fight. We have to vote. But we have to vote the court. We progressives must make these courts at the Supreme Court level and lower court level our issue. Today marks the day when progressives around this country launched a movement
for a progressive court. It may be a dark day for the court, but it's going to be a very bright day for the legal resistance in this country. So, our moment has come, and let us say together, no justice, no seat. No justice, no seat. No justice, no seat. Thank you. Thank you all for what you're doing.
And next, we have one of my personal heroes, someone who has inspired so many of us in the movement. And over the last month, Fatima Gosgraves of the National Women Law Center has been a support again and again and again. I don't know if we would be here today in this way without her. So with that, Fatima.
So I'm standing here, and I gotta admit, I'm feeling a little angry. I'm feeling frustrated, but I am not feeling defeated. I can't look around here and feel defeated. It is all of you that are giving me hope. You're giving me hope even as the Senate diminishes all of us with this vote that they're about to take. You're giving me hope as they're about to take a career-defining vote. They're about to put their legacy on the line and still go the wrong way. And when our children and their children ask which side of history were they on, what did they do when the Senate was asked to take sexual violence seriously? What did the Senate do when it was asked to preserve and protect the Supreme Court behind us and ensure that it was not forever tainted? What I know is that all of you have done everything that you could. And the Senate has failed us. The Senate has failed us. And to Christine Blasey Ford, I want to say what you did mattered. And to the thousands of survivors who told their stories, who shared their pain so publicly for all of our consumption, what you did mattered. You gave us the gift of a public teaching about sexual violence, and we will not go back. And the rage that so many of us are feeling, it will not be contained. It is that focused rage. It's the type of rage that made so many of us answer our sister's call with the Women's March and march in the millions in January 2017. Thank you. It is the sort of rage that made so many of us pick up Tarana Burke's brilliant Me Too framework and in the millions say Me Too. It is the rage that means thousands of women are running for office for the first time. So listen, I know that they held on to this nominee at any cost. They decided that they would hold on to him no matter what. And that was a call that they had to make. But you know what? The cost will be felt deeply. Because what has been unmasked this week and what is unmasked with this vote today is the plain and naked misogyny, and we will not go back. So I know all of you, you will channel this rage.
you will channel it for all of us in this fight. This fight has always been about so much. It has always been about this country. It has always been about our democracy. It has always been about the respect survivors deserve. It has been about the respect that women deserve. And it is about the world that I want for my children. And just as I believe Christine Blasey Ford, and just as I believed Anita Hill, and I still believe Anita Hill, I believe that we will get there. And I am so proud to be with all of you in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima. That was so powerful. We will not go back. 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 That's right. We will not go back. And I want to introduce one of my sisters in the movement who has a story a lot like mine, Leah Greenberg of Indivisible, one of the founders of Indivisible, is here today. And I think Indivisible has done an incredible job of mobilizing new activists in a similar way to Women's March, and this resistance wouldn't be what it is without them. So, Leah Greenberg.
Hello, thank you. I want to start by saying something so simple, but that we have to say because of where we are in this country. We believe Dr. Christine Blasey Ford.
For collegiality. He has an excellent relationship with all of his colleagues in the D.C. Circuit, and his judicial record demonstrates the same. Indeed, Judge Kavanaugh was in the majority in 97% of the cases that he participated in that D.C. Circuit. His Democratic-appointed colleagues were as likely to join majority opinions written by Judge Kavanaugh as his Republican-appointed colleagues were. He will bridge the divide in the Supreme Court. Judge Kavanaugh has also shown a dedication to public service, to mentorship, and to diversity. He spent all but 3 years of his legal career in public service. Judge Kavanaugh is a proven mentor to law students and young lawyers. Judge Kavanaugh has taught courses at Harvard Law School and other top law schools for many years. The Senate Judiciary Committee received a letter in support of his confirmation from these former students. They wrote, quote, "We will have differing views on political issues surrounding the confirmation process, but we will agree on one thing. Judge Kavanaugh is a rigorous thinker, a devoted teacher, and a gracious person," end of quote. Federal judges also play a very important role in mentoring the next generation of lawyers by hiring law clerks. Judge Kavanaugh has clearly taken seriously this mentorship role. His former law clerk submitted a letter to this committee strongly supporting his confirmation. I quote from that letter, "It was a tremendous stroke of luck to work for and be mentored by a person of his strength of character, generosity of spirit, intellectual capacity, and unwavering care for his family, friends, colleagues, and us, his law clerks," end of quote. One of the areas where Judge Kavanaugh has had a particular impact is his commitment to diversity. More than half of his law clerks have been female. When confirmed to the Supreme Court, his class of law clerks will be all female, the first time in the history of the Supreme Court. Judge Kavanaugh's female law clerks sent the committee a letter, and this is what this letter from the law clerk says, quote, "We know all too well that women in the workplace still face challenges, inequality, and even harassment. Among other things, women do not enjoy a representative share of prestigious clerkships or high-profile legal positions. But this committee and the American public more broadly should be aware of the important work Judge Kavanaugh has done to remedy those disparities. In our view, the judge has been one of the strongest advocates in the federal judiciary for women lawyers," end of quote.